Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone who's joined us today for this next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. It's my absolute privilege today to introduce Professor Troy McEwan, coming to us from the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science at Swinburne University in Australia. Professor McEwan is a professor of clinical and forensic psychology, and she's also a principal psychologist at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Mental Health, also known as Forensicare. Since the late 2000s, Troy's research has focused on understanding, assessing, and responding to problem behaviours like stalking, family violence, and fire setting. In addition to her publications, she's also co-authored several risk assessment guidelines for family violence and stalking used internationally, as well as recently co-authoring a book on treating stalking, which gives detailed and evidence-based guidance for practitioners working with this client group. She's also a past president of the Australian and New Zealand Association of Psychiatry, Psychology and Law, and sits on the editorial boards for Criminal Justice and Behaviour, Journal of Family Violence, and the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we have an expert speaking to us on stalking today. So without any further ado, over to you, Troy.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks so much for coming along to this talk. So look, I'm really pleased to be able to present this, particularly at the time I'm presenting it in New Zealand, given what's happening at the moment. And I think it was probably partly fortuitous, but partly also good planning on behalf of April and the team at the Institute, knowing that this was kind of a topic that was going to be very much of interest in New Zealand at this time. So I'm going to talk today about the intersection of stalking and homicide. I want to thank April and also the Institute for inviting me to give this presentation. Just before I kind of begin the presentation, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am. This is the Yarra Valley, it's where I am. It's Wurundjeri country, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of that country and that it was never ceded. I also want to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any First Nations people who are here with us today. Separate to that acknowledgement, I do also want to acknowledge some colleagues who were involved in some of the research that I'm going to be presenting as part of today's talk on stalking and homicide. So Abby Sheed, who is a senior research fellow here at the Centre in Melbourne, and then Cleo Brandt, who at the time of this work was working for Victoria Police and is now with Monash University. Just before I start, also, I've got no specific conflicts in relation to this talk. There is a couple of things at the end that I'll mention. I'll declare that I have an interest in those things when I mention them at the very end, so just so you're aware. But otherwise, I've got no kind of financial interest or anything like that in this talk. Okay, so what we're going to do over the next, little while, I'm aiming for about 45 minutes, we'll see how we go, is to talk about these things. I'm going to start off by just being really clear about what I mean by the word stalking. Okay, so what do I actually mean by that word? It's important to define what stalking is whenever you talk about it, because people use the word in different ways. And so it can get quite confusing if you're kind of talking at cross purposes. So I'll start by just being very clear about what I mean by stalking. And then we'll move into some discussion about this issue of stalking and homicide and why people are interested in it, what evidence there is of an association. And then I'm going to be slightly controversial, but I think with very good grounds, to say that stalking is not a risk factor for homicide and explain why that is, why that's the case. And then from there, I'm going to talk about that research that we've done here in Victoria just recently and say, well, if it's not a risk factor, what can we say about stalking and homicide, and what can we tell from this particular study we've done from this very large population cohort of homicides where we've identified prior stalking. And then I'm going to kind of pull all that together and talk about some implications for kind of policy and some practice implications. I'm really aware that we've got quite a varied audience for this talk. So there's going to be people here from lots of different backgrounds. Some people are going to be policy people, some people are going to be practice people. So please do ask questions about both. Also, if there's something that you want to ask, or if there's a wider issue you'd like to discuss that kind of I don't touch on or we don't have time for, I'm more than happy to receive an email to have a chat about things. So my email will be at the end, and I'm more than happy for people to email me directly if that's needed. I will just say I will provide a PDF of the slides back to April. So if you would like a PDF of the slides, you should be able to get that through the Institute. I'm going to send all the annoying emails to her rather than me dealing with that. So you have to kind of scribble everything down madly. You will be able to access a PDF. And I do believe this talk is also being recorded and it will be on their YouTube channel as well. Okay. So let's get going then. All right. Let's start off by talking about what stalking actually is. Now, this definition up here is a pretty kind of universally accepted definition. There's some nuance to it that I'm going to talk through. So the key elements of this definition are the idea that stalking is a pattern of behaviour. So it's not a one-off. Yeah, it's something that has to happen on multiple occasions, and it forms an episode or a course of conduct. Yeah, so there's a temporal element to stalking. There's a start, and then there's a series of behaviours, and then at some point, usually, it finishes as well. Okay, and that period from start to finish is the stalking episode. So in there, you have kind of repeated unwanted intrusions that are targeted towards a specific person or perhaps a group of victims, a group of people. Okay. Really, essentially, stalking is about pushing your way in where you're not wanted, okay, where you've got no legitimate right to be. Okay, you're forcing your way, you're imposing yourself into someone's life. And that's a really kind of important element of stalking to be aware of, because that's what makes it stalking. It's the idea that it's the contact with you is unwanted. Okay. The way I usually explain that, because that's kind of, it sounds kind of obvious, but it's actually a little bit tricky to get your head around. So the way I usually explain that is think about if someone is maybe calling or texting you multiple times a day, and maybe they're coming around to your house of an evening, and perhaps on important dates like your birthday or an anniversary, they might send you, like maybe they send flowers to your work or something, right? Okay. So if that's all happening and you want it to happen, you're probably either dating or maybe you're married to the person doing it, right? And you invite and you welcome that contact. If you don't want the person to do those things and it causes you distress that they are continuing to do that, that's stalking. Okay, so the same behaviours in one context are perfectly acceptable and socially appropriate and absolutely okay and desired by the victim, and in fact probably enjoyed by the victim. And in another context, they are potentially, in some jurisdictions, a criminal offence. We'll talk more about criminal offences in a second. But certainly we could define them as stalking, even where there is not a stalking law for the purposes of kind of risk assessment, management, intervention. That third bit that I've just kind of mentioned, the idea that it causes distress or fear, is also really important. And that's really how definitions of stalking kind of capture this idea that the behaviour has to have some sort of detriment to the victim. Okay, because if you don't have that element, you can capture very innocuous behaviour that is actually really not problematic. So it is quite important to have that part of the definition in there, this detriment to the victim. I'll talk more about that in a sec. All right, so that's our definition of stalking. There's some complexities to that I'm not touching on in this talk around whether stalking can happen during an intimate relationship or whether it only happens outside of the context of an ongoing relationship. I'm not going to get into that because I simply don't have time. It's a really important thing, and I think it's something that deserves some discussion, but I just simply don't have time to talk about that and talk about homicide in this talk, so I'm not going to. Just quickly, I want to touch on legislative definitions. Really, this is purely because of the current discussion in New Zealand, and I think it's an important thing to be thinking about when we're thinking about stalking, is how is it legislatively defined? In many places, for instance, in Victoria, it was legislatively defined almost before it was defined anywhere else. The Victorian stalking law passed in 1994. It was one of the first kind of batch of stalking laws that passed internationally, the first law being passed in California in 1990. There are pretty much stalking laws in almost every English-speaking jurisdiction, bar New Zealand. That hasn't been the case since 1990. It's been a kind of gradual process. Various definitions use kind of different ways of approaching it. They all try to capture some version of that definition I've got above, but they do it in slightly different ways, which has some important implications. Most laws require more than one unwanted behaviour. So that's how they capture repeated. They either say the word repeated or they say more than one. Some of them say a course of conduct, some say a pattern of behaviour, but they all imply this idea that there is a more than one behaviour. something when I saw the announcement around the potential New Zealand law I was quite interested in was this idea that the threshold is being set at 3 or more behaviours over a 12-month period. I thought that's a really unusual kind of threshold and kind of interesting. I'd be interested to see kind of where that came from. And I'd be interested to see whether that ends up in the actual final law or not, because it is slightly unusual. Some laws require evidence of continuity of purpose, but again, it's not that typical. In practice, for most jurisdictions, the idea that the behaviours are connected to each other and form a stalking episode in that sense, that's kind of left to the discretion of the police and the court to determine that there is evidence that this person, was engaging in a pattern of targeted behaviour. Again, I think the New Zealand proposal here, I'm assuming that's probably what the within 12 months is trying to capture. It's trying to say that if you've got at least 3 behaviours within 12 months, that's kind of some way of getting at the idea that they probably are connected in some way. I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it's quite unusual again. I'm not 100% convinced by it at this point, although I wait to be, because 3 behaviours in 12 months may not have a continuity of purpose. They may not be a stalking episode. They may be completely discrete behaviours. So it's maybe not capturing the actual thing that is stalking, even if legislatively it kind of works. So it's an interesting idea. And almost all laws, or actually pretty much all stalking laws, require some sort of detriment to the victim. The question really is where that detriment threshold is set. Some jurisdictions, although pretty much only in the USA these days, set fear as the threshold. It's a very high threshold for detriment, so the victim must have been afraid because of the pattern of behaviour. That level, that threshold is too high, in my view. It excludes a lot of people who should have access to the law as a remedy for the behaviour. Some places use psychological harm, which is a complex issue in law. Psychological harm is a difficult concept for law. Some places use things like distress or some other kind of more generic term. In an early version of the proposed New Zealand law that I saw, which doesn't seem to be similar to the one that's currently under discussion, so there's clearly been some more work done in the meantime. Actually, the early version I saw used a framing of it causes the victim to change their day-to-day behaviour, which I thought was a really interesting framing. I actually thought was quite a good framing of the impact, because it's kind of independent of value judgment. If there's evidence they're changing what they're doing because of the person's intrusion into their life, that to me is a really nice kind of objective or more objective way of measuring, rather than using kind of distress and fear. There's pros and cons, but I thought it was really nice. It'd be interesting to see whether that ever comes through in the New Zealand law. Anyway, I kind of put that in there because I want to have a little bit of a comment on what's been announced recently in regards to the New Zealand proposed law. So just out of interest. But just be aware, essentially what to take away from this is just be aware there are really different ways of thinking about what stalking is and what it means. And you really need to be very clear on what is meant by stalking in the context in which you're working, and also if you're applying research into your practice, what do they mean by stalking when they're using that word, because it's not used the same way by everyone. Okay, this is how I'm going to use it in this presentation. Sorry, a slight delay on my slides. All right, so let's get into the issue of stalking and homicide. So there's an interest in the intersection of these two things fundamentally because there are very well-known cases where stalking has ended in homicide. And there's 3 young women there on that slide, all of whom were killed by a man who stalked them. None of them were killed by an ex-partner, importantly. And that, I think, is a notable fact because these 3 cases are actually more unusual in the realm of stalking homicide, as we'll see later on in the talk, but they tend to attract the most media and political attention. So just very briefly, the young lady in the bottom left corner on the magazine cover, her name's Rebecca Schaefer. She was killed in 1989 by a young man who was a fan. She was an actor, and he shot her in her home after stalking her for approximately 3 years. And her death, along with several other homicides that had happened over the course of a few years in California, was a real trigger for the introduction of the first anti-stalking law in California. And you see that repeatedly. as laws are introduced, they tend to be, or not always, but they are often motivated by specific kinds of cases. That has pros and cons because very often stalking cases that end in homicide are quite unusual. And so it means you can get problems in the way that stalking is conceptualized if they're too closely tied to cases that end in homicide. An example, of course, of that, and many people will be familiar with Fazana Yakubi, who's the young lady in the top right corner. She's a Kiwi, and sadly she was killed in 2022 in Auckland, again by a man who'd stalked her for several months. And I'm sure many people here are far more knowledgeable about this case than I am, so I'm not going to kind of talk about it in too much depth, but very clearly her death and the kind of context around that and what had happened in the lead up to that has obviously been quite influential in what has happened with a kind of concept of stalking and stalking law in New Zealand since that time, and to the point that the minister referenced her death in his press release, although was very careful to say that it was certainly not the only reason that this law was being proposed in New Zealand. The lady in the middle, her name is Celeste Mano. She was killed in Melbourne in November 2020. Now, Victoria has had a stalking law, as I said, since 1994. And Celeste Mano was killed after being stalked for approximately 18 months by a former work colleague, someone she didn't know very well, or really at all, to be honest. And her death prompted, rather than a new law, a review of the existing stalking law by the Law Reform Commission in Victoria, and I'll talk more about that later on in the talk. So you can see that these kinds of homicides attract a lot of attention. They drive change in a political and legislative sense. But very frequently they don't drive change in a policy practice sense. And that's a really important thing to be aware of. I'm going to come back to that at the end of the talk. So this is why we're interested, because this happens and we know it happens, and it happens, obviously far too often. In terms of the translation of that into research or evidence, there's been a lot of written about stalking and homicide over the last 30 or so years. Obviously, most recently, the New Zealand Family Violence Death Review put together a paper on stalking and homicide from their work, as you can see at the bottom there. But there's been similar things done in other countries, the UK, in the US. There's been some research done that I'll talk about. So this is a topic of research interest. It's not a massive literature. It's a fairly limited literature, but certainly there is a literature on it. Probably the first study that mentioned homicide in the context of stalking was this paper by Reid Malloy. Now, you remember I mentioned the first stalking law was introduced in 1990. And to be honest, stalking didn't exist as a concept really earlier than that. You don't have a concept of stalking, before probably the very late 1980s. It just simply doesn't exist as an idea, all right? It's a constructed idea that we came up with to describe something we decided was a social problem. That's not to say that it's not a social problem. It is a social problem. It's a very damaging social problem, but it's a particular culture and time-bound idea of what that problem is and what we should call it and how we should think about it. So Reid did this study. He looked at all 10 studies that had been published to that point up until about 1995. A couple were Australian. There was US, I think maybe one UK study, but I'm not sure. And he basically pulled the data from those studies together and he described what we knew about stalking at that point. Okay, it wasn't a meta-analysis for the researchers in the room. It was literally just a kind of a narrative, descriptive kind of account. And in that, he made this comment that in these samples, the incidence of homicide was less than 2%. So in this sample of 180 international stalking cases that had been published on, fewer than 2% of those cases were associated with homicide. Okay. Now, of course, the first 10 studies of stalking were pretty unusual samples. And unfortunately, that sentence was interpreted by some to mean the incidence of homicide in stalking cases is somewhere near 2%. Now, that's not, of course, what Reid meant. And it's also physically not possible because if that was the case, I don't want to be crude, but we would literally be falling over bodies in the street. Stalking is so common that if a homicide rate of 2% was anywhere near what was the reality, you couldn't move without having people getting killed by their stalkers. So it's just clearly a massive overestimate for what the reality is. Okay. Subsequent to that initial kind of study, that you get a literature that emerges in the intimate partner violence literature. So where stalking is kind of talked about within the wider context of intimate partner violence. And so in the late 1990s, you get people starting to do studies where stalking is examined as a variable within the context of specifically intimate partner homicide, and specifically within that, intimate partner femicide, so men killing their female current or former partners, okay? So these two studies are probably the first two very, very influential studies. Anyone in this field will recognise Judith McFarlane and Jacqueline Campbell's names. Jacqueline Campbell is lead author of the Danger Assessment, which is a widely used assessment in the intimate partner violence literature and practice. And so they did this really interesting design where they basically got two samples. They collected across a number of US cities. They collected samples of women who had been killed by their male partners, current or former. And they collected samples, matched samples of women who had been abused, subject to physical abuse, but there'd never been an attempt, successful or otherwise, to kill them by that partner. And they basically interviewed the women who were abuse victims. They interviewed the family members and also looked at police files and things of the women who'd been killed, or in the case of attempted homicide, they talked to the women themselves. And they collected a lot of information about these cases, and then they basically compared the two groups. Okay, and they said, what's different about these two groups? One of the things they compared on was the presence of stalking. Now, these studies actually used a really quite good definition of stalking, and that's a real issue in the stalking literature. How you define stalking is quite a complicated thing. But they actually used quite a good definition of stalking, and you can see there that what they found was that people who were had been killed or there'd been an attempt to kill them, they more commonly found stalking in those cases than in just the pure abuse cases, okay? So these studies were kind of the first time people started to talk about the idea that stalking could be some sort of risk factor for intimate partner femicide, okay? Very, very influential studies. They followed up, same research group in the States, followed up with some more research. They expanded the methodology to an extra city, so they get a new sample, and they changed how they measured stalking in this study. It's not quite as clear how they measured it. Possibly it was some sort of adaptation for the danger assessment. It's not quite clear. You can see the prevalence of stalking drops dramatically in this study compared to the previous two, but you still see the same. That's probably to do with the definition. You still see the same pattern, though, where the women who were killed or where there'd been attempted murder, far more commonly stalking was present in those cases than it was present in the abused control cases. So again, we find this conclusion that maybe stalking is some sort of risk factor for homicide. Basically, what they found was the odds of stalking were the odds of homicide was far, far greater if there'd been stalking, than if there hadn't been. That's basically the way they did it. That then translates, so you start to see people talking about the idea of stalking as a risk factor for intimate partner femicide from the kind of early 2000s. It starts to appear, and many people here will be very familiar with that as a concept. They may use it in their practice. And so by 2018, there's this very, very influential meta-analysis published by Chelsea Spencer and Sandra Stith, very good researchers from the States, really good in this area, very strong researchers. A meta-analysis is just you pull together data from lots of different studies and you pool it and you conduct analyses that allow you to make stronger claims, okay? Because it's pooling lots and lots of data across different studies. So you kind of try to even out the weaknesses of different studies, right? So in this particular study, they looked at risk factors for intimate partner femicide, and they looked at a whole bunch of different things, one of which was stalking. So the stalking cases were the stalking studies they included in their meta-analysis were the 4 studies I just mentioned. Okay, so they were the studies included. And so as you can see, they basically looked at that and they said, yes, okay, so these 4 studies found increased odds. That's what the numbers at the far right of the screen are. They're the odds ratios. So increased odds of homicide when stalking was present. Fine. This is their final kind of conclusion. So these are their kind of the strongest risk factors for intimate partner femicide that they found across this big meta-analysis, very influential meta-analysis. So you can see a whole bunch of different things there. Most of these studies are American, so direct access to guns might be influenced by that. But you can see highlighted in yellow, perpetrated stalking. It's in the top 10. It's a really important risk factor for intimate partner femicide with an odds ratio of about 3. So basically that's saying that when stalking is present, the odds of homicide are increased by about 3 times. Okay. Seems really important, right? Seems really, really influential and important. And certainly that's how it translates into practice from this kind of research. The problem is there's a couple of issues with this research and whether we can actually conclude that stalking is a risk factor for homicide. Okay, so the first thing, and this is more a thing for the stalking literature than the intimate partner violence literature and stalking practice, is that these studies are not studies of stalking as a complete construct. They are studies of a very specific subgroup of stalking cases. So they really only measure partner femicide, and we know that less than half of stalking is by partners, whether you include current and former, whether you just look at former, less than half. Most stalking, if you do include both current and former partners, most is still former partners. A small number is current partners. We know that there's quite a few men who are victims of stalking. In forensic samples, it's probably 10 to 20%. In community samples, it's more like 30%. So you're excluding a significant group of victims from these studies. So probably it's capturing somewhere around 45% of stalking cases in this kind of research. It's not actually representative of the general relationship between stalking and homicide. Okay. My question is, I'm not sure whether these studies actually measured stalking or whether they measured something else. In particular, because these studies they all included behavior both in a relationship and following the breakdown of the relationship. And so for me, that kind of raises issues of, are they actually measuring coercive control? So are they actually measuring behavior within a relationship that is, coercively controlling, monitoring and surveillance, these kinds of things? And then they're calling that stalking, which at the time, no one was really using the term coercive control. Back in the late 90s, it wasn't a term that was used widely. So they called that stalking at the time, but maybe their results are actually more reflective of a relationship between coercive control and stalking. Coercive control and homicide. Okay. So that's kind of an open question. And so that's something we were quite interested in the study I'm going to talk about in a sec. And then the biggest problem is that they used a case control method. So you know how I said they created two samples and compared them and looked for differences? That's a perfectly legitimate way to do this to do research. It's a really legitimate way of identifying kind of potential risk factors, but it's not predictive. It doesn't let you conclude that there is a predictive relationship between the risk factor and subsequent outcome, in this case, homicide. So the problem basically is that homicide is really, really unusual and rare. Okay, so in New Zealand, as in Australia, it's kind of, in the realm of 1 to 2 people per 100,000 people in any 1 year will be killed. It's very, very unusual. So even if you have increased odds, remember in Spencer and Stiff's meta-analysis, stalking was associated with 3 times greater odds of homicide. Even if you have 3 times greater odds of homicide, greater odds of a very, very rare thing is still a very, very rare thing. Yeah, so it doesn't help you actually predict it because there's never enough of the outcome to actually say that the presence of stalking is related to, a noticeable increase in the outcome because it's just so very rare. Okay, that probably doesn't make sense to everybody, so I'm going to just give a practical example. Right, so if we think about Victoria, state I live in as an example, right? So we know from the Australian Bureau of Statistics there were 84 homicides in Victoria in 2022. Okay, now I've taken one of the statistics from McFarlane's study. I've said, okay, 61% of homicides are preceded by stalking. Now I know that's not correct, but just for the purposes of this example, let's go with it. So 57 of 84 is 61% of homicides being preceded by stalking. Okay, that's what that cell indicates. All right, and then 27 homicides had no stalking preceding them. Okay, so this is probably an overestimate of how commonly stalking is actually there in homicide. All right, that looks really good. That looks like, hey, if we can spot the stalking, we might be able to prevent a really significant number of homicides. Okay? The problem is that when you take that out, if you take that and expand that out to the entire population of Victoria, it becomes very problematic. So this number down here, the 5 million, that's the population of Victoria in 2022. Right? So we can expect, given what we know about the prevalence of stalking, that in 2022, about 100,000 people were stalked in Victoria in 2022. And the other 4.9 million people weren't stalked. Okay, we know this from big samples, the Personal Safety Survey in Australia. We know kind of roughly how common stalking is. So the problem is that if we use stalking as a risk factor for homicide, hey, yes, 57 people who stalked will go on to commit a homicide. Absolutely. But over 100,000 people who are stalked do not have a homicide. Okay. So if you assume that the presence of stalking means that there's likely to be a homicide, or even that there's increased risk of being a homicide, you're going to be wrong in 99 point, whatever it says there, 9994% of cases. And that's going to lead to problems with resource allocation, with creating unnecessary anxiety for people. Those are all sorts of problems. Okay. There's a base rate issue, okay, and you can't overcome because stalking is very rare. So it's very problematic to suggest that stalking is a risk factor, because in reality, everyone who stalks is extremely low risk of homicide, because homicide is just very unusual. Okay. I'll get to what we can maybe do about that a little later. Okay. So that's kind of where we're at the moment in terms of what we know about stalking and homicide. There's a bit of a problem with this idea that stalking is a risk factor for homicide, but there is some data about it. We have some knowledge about the kind of intersection between. So we set out to do some research here in Victoria. We had a big population of homicide cases, and so we were interested in trying to just kind of overcome some of those things. So we wanted to establish the prevalence of all stalking. Yeah, so try and look at how commonly does stalking appear for homicide in any homicide case, not just intimate partner femicide. And we wanted to investigate whether there were differences in the stalking that you saw in homicide cases compared to what we know about stalking in other contexts that doesn't result in homicide. Okay, so to see a little bit like what the other studies have done. Are there differences between these groups? Okay. We also did this kind of question around coercive control and stalking. I'm not going to talk about today because I just don't have the time and space. It's quite a complicated thing. I'm happy to have a chat with anyone else about that. Subsequent to this, if you're interested. This paper is published online. If you use that QR code, it will take you to the location for the paper. I will just say, April's just put it in the chat as well, so the actual link itself, if you just want to click on it. I will just say there is an error in this paper. Okay, so we have to actually do a correction. There's a problem with the coercive control and stalking numbers that are presented. There's actually an error in them. We're talking to the journal at the moment about how to correct it. Please, if you do go and get this paper and you want to use those information about coercive control and stalking, please contact me and I can tell you the actual numbers that should be there that are incorrect in Table 5. Okay. Okay, so what we actually did to do this study is we looked at every single homicide with a reported court outcome in the Supreme Court or the Coroner's Court in Victoria over a 19-year period. We identified the Court Services Victoria gave us the names of these cases, and then we went and looked them up in publicly available data set, which is OSTLY. It's an online account of all the sentencing comments that judges make in homicide cases. And we also accessed the coronial outcomes through the National Coronial Information Service, which is not public, but we accessed those and looked at those as well. And then we coded very extensively from that data, those sources. We did iterated reliability coding to make sure that we were kind of coding similarly, and we did double coding of all the stalking cases to make sure things were accurate. So iterated reliability was good. It was kind of agreement in over 90% of cases in most variables, 80 to 90 in most behavioural variables, with only victim kind of related variables being a little bit less than that, because there was less information about victims in the sentencing comments. So just very quickly, some definitions. I've already defined stalking. It's very similar. You'll note that the absence of an ongoing relationship. Then we separately define coercive control. Okay, so this is just, so when I'm saying stalking in this study, I do mean stalking after the end of an intimate relationship or where there's no other relationship between stalker and victim. And ex-partner basically just means that the relationship was not intact at the time of the homicide. Okay, so I'm going to use those two terms throughout this so you may know what I mean. So we had 850 odd homicides. You can see there, kind of basic descriptive information. Obviously, as in all homicide, males are predominantly the victims and predominantly the perpetrators. When you look at homicides in general, men are more likely to be victims of homicide. If you look at current and former partners in particular, that changes and women are more likely to become victims of that particular kind of homicide. Still, men are most perpetrators, but you also get more female perpetrators in intimate partner homicide as well. Just in terms of gender split, that's just showing it across the various relationship groups in the entire sample. Okay, so just showing that in a visual way. You can see that current and former partners, the blue being the women, more victims are women. All right. So in terms of stalking prevalence, headline figure, basically we found in 855 cases, we found 54 cases where there was clear evidence of stalking that could be ascertained from judges' sentencing comments prior to the homicide. There was almost all cases we could identify whether it was present or absent. There were 12 cases where it was unclear. And so the really kind of marked figure here is that in the ex-partner group, so the ex-partners who were killed, people who were killed by an ex-partner, apologies, 2/3 essentially, there's evidence of stalking prior to that. Okay, amongst all the other kinds of stalking, other relationships, it's about 4%. Okay, remember that's partly because there's heaps of other, most homicides involve strangers or acquaintances, so the other relationships fall into that. Okay, remember we don't include current partners because they're our definition of stalking in this particular study, so current partners don't exist in this. If you look at the gender split across those relationship types, you can see still we have predominantly female victims of the former partners, and then for the other family, slight majority of female victims, but then for acquaintance and strangers, it's really either even in the acquaintance group, slightly more males in the stranger group, but it's so small numbers that it's really not, it's probably more like it's even. Okay, so you get a really different kind of picture in terms of male and female victimisation in stalking cases, depending on the kind of relationship. This is similar to what you see in stalking without homicide. Okay, it's very similar to this. Just to quickly talk about the two groups. So in the acquaintance, stranger and the other family cases, so basically everyone except ex-partners, there's 28 victims. They're a slight majority of the sample of 54, wide range of ages. You can see there's children in there. So most of the other family relationships are children, okay, who are being killed by the person who's stalking and then commits a homicide. There's 4 murder-suicides in this group, so about 14% of this sample is murder-suicide. This group was really marked for the presence of multiple homicides, okay, so really kind of, 7 cases account for 14 deaths and 1 attempted homicide. It's quite marked, quite unusual. So there's something kind of hasn't been looked at before in any of the other homicide studies because none of them have looked at these relationships. So the ex-partner cases, so 26, you can see there's about, in half of cases, the homicide happens within 4 months of the end of the relationship. Okay, so that's what the median is. It's a halfway point. A greater proportion of murder-suicides, about twice the number of murder-suicides in this group. There are no cases where the stalker killed both the ex-partner and the children. Okay, so there's actually no cases that go across those two. So it's worth just noting that where you don't get that kind of family annihilation in these cases, which we were a little bit surprised by, to be honest. We thought there would be, but there weren't. Really remarkably, when we looked at these cases more closely, one of the things we could see was that actually when we looked at the acquaintance, stranger, other family, we could actually see that 17 of those 28 victims, the person or people who were killed were related in some way to the homicide offender's ex-partner. Okay, so what was happening, it was not always possible to tell, but often you could. They were actually stalking the ex-partner and the people around the ex-partner, and then they killed someone who wasn't the ex-partner, but in the context of ex-partner stalking. Okay, so 8 children fell into this group. So the children in the other sample often fall into that group. They're not killing the ex-partner, but they're killing the children. Notably, not all those children were biological children of the ex-partner. It was other children as well. There were 6 men who were killed who were perceived as potential new partners to the offender's ex-partner. So really substantial number. And this is something we've always known in the stalking literature, that the new boyfriend is really at risk. This is the first time we've seen kind of what proportion of homicides actually the new boyfriend is actually the victim. And then there were 3 adult family members of the ex-partner. So I think a couple of people who were the mother of the ex-partner and a sister, which was actually a case of mistaken identity. They intended to kill the ex-partner and they thought the sister was the ex-partner. Okay, so that's just some basic kind of descriptive information. When you look at a couple of other data points, so I've already mentioned the gender disparity. Notably, there's lots and lots of people who've emigrated to Australia in these samples. This is not unusual in homicide samples. This is something you see a lot in homicide samples. People who are immigrants are overrepresented in homicide samples. There's various theories as to why that would be, but this is something that is not unusual to this particular study. In Australia, I should have looked this up immediately before. I've just had a mental blank. I want to say about 30% of Australians are born overseas. So you can see that these numbers are substantially kind of different to that. So we'd expect about 70% of victims and offenders to be born in Australia, and you can see that it's lower than that. If we look at the characteristics of the offenders, the homicide offenders themselves, so the table on the left is in the total sample, the prevalence of the various characteristics in the sample of homicide offenders. The graph on the right compares your ex-partner stalking homicide offenders to your other relationship stalking homicide offenders. Okay, this is just both of these things are just in the stalking homicide sample. So you can see the notable differences. We didn't do any significance testing because the sample was too small, so we just didn't do any. Notably, substance use seems to be more common, as does mental health and personality disorder in the other relationship, the non-ex-partners. History of violence may be slightly more common, suicidality more common amongst the ex-partners. Okay. Of the homicide victims, we couldn't collect as much information because the judge's sentencing comments didn't provide as much background depth about the victims. That's not because the judges didn't care. It's the nature of how sentencing is done. There's more focus on the offender than there is on the victim in terms of their history. So you can see that ex-partner stalking homicide victims had higher rates of identified mental health problems. Unsurprising, given what we know about intimate partner violence and mental health. But interestingly, in terms of lacking supports and resources, it was the non-ex-partner group that actually seemed to face more challenges in this area, maybe reflective of the fact that there's not services for stalking victims who aren't stalked by an ex-partner or family member. In terms of the actual behaviours themselves, not really any huge differences between the groups. Prior stalking violence refers to, in the stalking episode before the homicide, there had been physical violence towards the victim or another person. Okay, so the primary stalking victim or a secondary person who was involved in that stalking case. But yeah, not massive differences. A little bit of difference. The other relationship group actually had a greater history of violence, which was actually surprising to us. That's unusual in stalking. Ex-partners are much more violent typically in stalking cases. And then ex-partners did more monitoring and surveillance. Okay, that's pretty much the only real differences there. Finally, we looked at a set of particular risk factors which have been referred to as red flag risk factors in literature in various different ways, in both stalking literature and in threat assessment literature and in intimate partner violence literature in some cases. So we want to look at those particular risk factors. And what we found was that all of those risk factors were very common. Really importantly, when you think about these risk factors, these are acute dynamic risk factors. These are things that are present in the days, weeks, out to a couple of months prior to the homicide. We're not talking about things that happened a long time before, all right? So in that immediate period right before, you see these things very, very commonly, okay? In ex-partner cases, in 100% of cases, there was something that appeared to be a trigger. So these were things like, resolution of a custody dispute, bankruptcy, loss of job, victim starting a new relationship. There were things that were perceived as placing additional stress or exacerbating the situation in that lead-up period to the homicide. Of course, that's hindsight, right? We don't know how many times there's triggers and nothing happens. It's the same base rate problem. Okay, so let's just summarise those findings quickly before we get into kind of implications. So at least 1 in 20 homicides preceded by stalking. Okay, it's pretty common. Okay, and very typically, or actually almost never, were there stalking charges. Okay, we had a stalking law the entire time this study period. There was no real stalking charges in these cases. They weren't charged with stalking if they killed someone. So it's very hard to see the stalking. As I said, nearly 2 in 3 ex-partner homicides, there was very clear evidence of stalking prior. Just don't take that to mean that it's a risk factor. Okay, coming back to that base rate problem, if you actually look at the actual numbers in Victoria over this time, we had 26 evidence of stalking in 26 homicide cases. We would expect there's nearly 1 million stalking cases in Victoria over that 20 years. Okay, 1 million ex-partner stalking cases. All right, so again, hardly any of the ex-partner stalking cases actually ended in a homicide. All right, so again, just please don't take that high prevalence of stalking prior to homicide to mean that it's a risk factor. You've got to think about it the other way around. How often does stalking happen, and then how often does a homicide happen afterwards? It's not a risk factor. really, the stalking homicides didn't look different to the other stalking that we know about. Okay, when we compared it to the wider literature, it's really pretty much the same kinds of behaviour, largely similar personal histories. There's nothing really remarkable that we could see about these stalking cases until the point of the homicide. The things that may be different, that immigration background I referenced, the fact that there was less antisocial and less violence in the ex-partner group, that was kind of surprising to us, that is different to the general stalking literature, but it is consistent with one other study that's been done where they did find that when people who stalk engage in very serious or catastrophic violence, often it's the people without lots of antisocial history. So it kind of isn't, they don't look antisocial, but the violence is very significant. And that might be to do with this. It might be that the risk factors for, if there are any risk factors for very significant severe violence in stalking cases, they are about acute dynamic warning signs. They're not about these generic background factors. They aren't helping us. But maybe these kinds of things, if we look more closely at the acute dynamic things that are happening right around the time of the homicide, maybe there's something there. In particular, we know, because we've actually looked at this in general samples of stalkers we've recruited in Melbourne, in Victoria, we know that suicidal thinking, it's more common than it is in the general population, but it's nowhere near as common as it was in this stalking homicide sample. Similarly, last resort thinking, it happens in stalking, but it's nowhere near as common as it was in this sample. So maybe those things actually do differentiate the homicide from the other when they're present. Again, we don't know how often suicidality and last resort thinking happen without there being a homicide. So we've still got our base rate problem, but maybe this can help us to target things a bit more closely. Okay, so let's just wrap up with some implications. Let's talk about implications of all this. Right, I think I've harped on this enough. Stalking is not a risk factor for homicide. Don't assume homicide is more likely in any noticeable way if you have a stalking case, even an ex-partner stalking case, okay? It's not the presence of the stalking per se that's probably very important. It's what's happening recently and now, okay? It's those acute dynamics. When was the things happening close to the, there's an imminent risk issue, but not a general risk issue potentially. Maybe these are some of those things we could be thinking about for imminent risk. Maybe we need some better and more research, all right? But maybe these are the things that suggest, hey, this is where we should be actually doing that more intensive risk management for imminent risk. It's really threat management, it's threat assessment and threat management as opposed to risk, okay? If we do that, we probably can prevent some homicides. We won't prevent all of them because some of the homicides won't look like this, but we can probably prevent some of them if we focus our efforts in on these acute kind of dynamic cases. But I kind of want to finish the last kind of few minutes of the talk by just kind of suggesting that maybe we're making an error by focusing so much on homicide. Maybe this is actually something that's not as helpful as it initially seems. If we think about stalking, as I said, there's basically 2 million stalking cases in Australia over 19 years, right? All stalking, not just ex-partners, but all stalking cases. 54 homicides, okay? We're kind of missing all the harm. We're not paying attention to all the harm that's just about stalking. We need to, in my view, stop looking for the needle, start looking at the haystack, manage the haystack, and in doing that, we'll help to prevent some of the needles and we'll prevent some of the homicides from occurring. But if we can have a management approach that responds to the haystack, we're going to do better. Because otherwise we're just ignoring actually most of the harm from stalking, which is not homicide. Most of the harm from stalking is all the other things that stalking causes. Homicide is actually very, very rare, despite being obviously catastrophic. So I want to just finish with kind of 3 things that I think are helpful in terms of preventing and stopping stalking, which will probably also help to prevent and stop stalking homicide, just by virtue of the fact that you're helping to prevent stalking. Kind of tie this back to the current situation in New Zealand. So if you have a think about the current kind of legal and discussion that's happening in New Zealand while I'm talking about these things. The first thing is we just need greater awareness of stalking. There's a real recognition problem. This problem affects police. We have research showing internationally that it affects police. It affects the general community. Most people who are stalked don't identify that they are stalked. They don't recognise the behaviour as stalking, so they don't say the word stalking when they describe it, which prevents recognition. Courts don't recognise stalking because it's typically not charged as stalking. So there's just this problem of awareness. And so we're not even seeing the issue very well in our systems. There are things we could do about this. The UK and the US, they have awareness campaigns. They run awareness. So the joined forces one is the UK. They have a National Stalking Awareness Week. Police agencies, domestic violence support agencies, all sorts of places get really involved in this. There's lots of emphasis on it. The American one's slightly different. It's a month, but there's similarly a lot of emphasis, a lot of kind of public kind of events and things to help people understand what stalking is. There's some really good resources that have been developed in the UK that it can generalise across. We can bring them across to Australia and New Zealand. The second thing is that we need better supports for victims because there's nothing. There's some stuff for family violence stalking victims, but even that's not specific to stalking, and there are particular things about stalking that is particularly challenging. And there's basically nothing for people who perpetrate stalking. And if we're not responding to people who stalk, we're not going to prevent it. And it's not the victims that are causing the stalking. We need to respond to the people who are doing the thing and help them not do it. Again, there's examples, in the UK, they've got specialist stalking victim advocates, right, in specific organisations right across the UK. They are specific to stalking and they respond to all stalking. They're not family violence victim advocates. There's a national stalking helpline in the UK. Anyone can call that number and get advice if they think they're being stalked, and get a basic risk assessment. There's, this is where I have one of my conflicts of interest. So we've published this book just recently for clinicians working with people who stalk to provide some kind of, I wouldn't say evidence-based, but it's certainly consensus-based, and because there's not enough evidence to say that it's evidence-based, but pulling together literature about how can we help people who stalk to help them stop stalking. We know that criminal justice responses don't work. Recidivism rates are upwards of 50% of continued stalking after a criminal justice involvement, right? It doesn't work. We need to provide supports to help people stop stalking. Can't just lock everybody up. There's too many of them, and not everyone deserves to get locked up. But we need to do other things as well. And then finally, we need more effective criminal justice responses, okay? It's just not good. It's for lots of different reasons. If you're interested, the Victorian Law Reform Commission stalking report that was released in 2022, it's available online. Just Google VLRC stalking and it will come up. I had lots of recommendations about criminal justice things that could be better. Some of those recommendations are being implemented by the Victorian government next year, but really only as they relate to the law and courts in a minimal way. Nothing else is happening. There's no money. In the UK, multi-agency stalking intervention programs, these are multi-agency teams that actually provide police, corrections, victim advocacy and mental health coming together to help understand and manage really complex and high-risk stalking cases. Really, really useful and important. There's been evaluations done. It's cost-effective. It's a thing that could be done. Why aren't we doing it? There's tools that can, again, conflict of interest. I'm an author of the SASH, but, the Dutch police use the SASH to help them prioritise stalking cases for response. Victoria Police recently has trialled that. That's what the article at the bottom there is about. Again, you can access that online if you're interested. If you're a police officer and interested, just Google police life stalking and it'll come up. It'll talk a bit about it. So there are things happening, but I think what I want you to walk away from this last slide with is even if New Zealand introduces a stalking law, it won't actually help to prevent stalking or to get a better response. We've had stalking laws in Victoria for 30 years and we still have all of these problems. A law by itself will achieve very little unless it's matched with a set of policy responses and systems and structures that can help people to recognise stalking, give those supports to victims and perpetrators, and make sure the criminal justice system can actually respond in an effective way to get people into those supports and get them to the help when they need it. Otherwise, your law is going to achieve very little. And that is the end.